From Wondery, I'm Patrick Wyman. Welcome to another episode of Tides of History. Thanks for joining me. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of an interview, we're going to have an informal chat about one of my very favorite topics, archaeology. So Leah is going to sit in with me here today. She's going to chime in from time to time to make sure I don't get too rambly.
I am happy to do that job. It is what I was born to do.
It is entirely possible that I'm going to get too rambly because I love archaeology. In fact, when I was finishing up my master's degree, getting a PhD in archaeology was one of the things I very strongly considered, actually focusing on castles and battlefield archaeology. So, in a not that implausibly different world, I'm probably a commercial archaeologist somewhere in Ireland or the UK right now.
What is a commercial archaeologist?
So a commercial archaeologist is much more common in countries that have really strict heritage laws and long periods of occupation. So there are laws about, like, if you're putting in a sewer or something and you run across some old remains, you have to bring in commercial archaeologists, one of these companies, to dig it up and figure out what exactly is there before you can proceed with your sewer or basement or water main or what have you.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a whole business that doesn't really exist in the United States because we don't have that long a period of occupation. They do exist, but there aren't that many of them. So, obviously, I did not end up becoming a commercial archaeologist, but I still love archaeology. Even more than that, I think archaeology is a really valuable tool. We use it here on Tides all the time. So here today, we're going to go over precisely what archaeology is and what makes it so useful. We'll talk about the state of the field and where it's going, how it ties into the practice of history, and we'll be sure to go off on lots of tangents about interesting sites.
Patrick, you mentioned archaeology just as a tool for historians. Can you walk me through what exactly is in the historian's toolbox?
One of the things that I like about history as a discipline is that you end up being kind of a jack of all trades. You use sociological methods, anthropological methods, you use things from literary theory, you use statistics, you can use all sorts of different things in order to analyze your textual sources, analyze whatever other sources you're using to try to come to an understanding of the past. Archaeology is one of those tools. Material culture, what you get from archaeology, is a really important thing if you want to understand the past. It's especially useful for periods where we don't have a lot of texts, of which there are a great many, especially the early Middle Ages, the period that I first started working on. We have very few texts. So if you want to actually understand this period, you have to use the evidence that's available to you. And the evidence that's available to you comes from archaeology.
Okay, Patrick, what is archaeology?
Archaeology is just digging up and studying the material remains of the past. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but it actually extends to everything from human remains to the objects that we use to buildings to whole landscapes. Not just digging them up, but also once you've got the stuff out of the ground, you got to figure out what it is. You got to interpret it.
It is mind-blowing that one tiny piece of rock fragment could unlock an entire history that you had never even heard of before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things about archaeology is, like, you can be dealing with massive piles of evidence, like big piles of pottery, or you can be dealing with single tiny little objects. You can be dealing with one tiny little coin or one tiny little, like a flake. So if you're dealing with sites from the Neolithic, like the New Stone Age, then which falls under the purview of archaeology, then one tiny little stone flake can tell you a very great deal about the people who used that site. It can tell you when it dates from, for example.
Say I'm looking at a land area, and I'm like, okay, cool, I think there was something here, I'm not sure. How do you even decide where to begin? Or if you're looking at the entire recorded history of a country, including things that you've, again, kind of guessed at based on different sources, how do you even know where to start digging? How do you even know where to start looking for any of these remains?
So it depends on the period that you're talking about. For really, really old stuff, you may just look at the landscape and be like, that's an interesting bump. That looks like these other bumps that we've excavated that show evidence from this particular period. Sometimes there's stuff still surviving above the ground. You might have like a collection of stone walls, and you think, okay, well, I'd like to know what's under those walls, what else was here, what kind of remains, other kinds of remains go along with those buildings. Sometimes you look at historical sources, at documentary sources. So look at the late Middle Ages and you see records of a particular village that no longer exists now. You can go out and see, okay, these documentary sources I have go along with these lumps and bumps in the landscape, and we're going to go out and we're going to dig them and find out how the two things correlate. So those are some methods. You have others. There's aerial photography. You take pictures from a plane, you look out, and you will often see remains of kind of features in the landscape that are not necessarily visible from the ground. Now, something that's really fascinating to me is satellite archaeology. Areas that you were never going to fly a plane over to take really like high-res photos to look for. But now you got satellite imagery and you can go out and look for those things. Now, once you've got the site, you got to figure out where to dig, right?
Yeah.
So there's a whole bunch of different tools for that. Again, some of it's just like what are the lumps and bumps that we can see if we go over this really closely. You can look at something called LiDAR. So that's you basically shoot a bunch of lasers and get a picture of the landscape, and you can find very small scale kind of lumps and bumps and see, okay, there's probably something under here. You can look for parch marks in a field. Let's say you've got a big field of grass, or if there are slightly browned patches within that, that could be evidence of a stone wall underneath, because it can interfere with the ability of the grass to grow on top of that.
Huh.
So right now there was a huge drought in the UK over the summer, right? And it revealed all sorts of new sites because it made the parch marks in fields much more prominent. They found way more than they would normally find, just because it was so much drier. These parch marks showed up in much starker relief.
So bad for crops, good for archaeologists.
Bad
this
for
summer.
crops, good for archaeologists. Yeah. Other ways, you have a whole bunch of different kind of geophysical investigation. You run ground penetrating radar over a site. You can see the depth at which kind of anomalies pop up. There are magnetic surveys. Got a lot of different ways once you've actually found the site to figure out where you're going to put your trenches and where you're going to dig to try to see what's underneath.
Okay. We just ran through a ton of stuff that you have to be able to grasp as an archaeologist, which sounds kind of like the flip side of our historian's toolbox. This is the archaeologist toolbox. And that's a ton. I'm assuming there are generalists who do all of these things, and then there would also be specialists, just like in history?
Yeah, so if you've done academic training in archaeology, you will have some exposure to all of these different things. But yes, they're absolutely specialists. There are some people who are really into the digging piece of it, and so they are experts in going out to a site, figuring out where you're going to dig, and the actual technical craft of opening up trenches and digging for remains, whether those are human remains or walls of buildings, or you're looking for kind of material finds. Like there are people who specialize in that and just going out and doing the actual digging piece of it, because that's a whole set of technical skills that you have to do that. There are people who specialize in particular places in particular periods, right? So you can have people who are Roman archaeologists. They specialize in the archaeology of the Roman period. Or late medieval archaeologists who specialize in things like, late medieval villages that were abandoned during the Black Death. Like there are people who specialize in those kinds of sites. In going out and digging them and interpreting the things that you find in them. Then there are people who are not big into the digging at all. What they specialize in is the interpretation of finds, either of small scale finds or of taking a whole bunch of different finds and aggregating them and figuring out, what is the Neolithic era look like. That's all kind of the interpretation of archaeological finds that's done by archaeologists.
I want to take a moment right here to mention the phenomenal program called Time Team.
Yes.
So Time Team is a show that was on the BBC. It ran for like 200 episodes. And in each episode, a team of archaeologists goes and visits different historic sites and they excavate. They have like 3 days to find whatever they're looking for. It's very excellent and very soothing, and you can watch it on YouTube, Acorn, or Amazon. I was watching an episode of Time Team. They had a ceramics and pottery specialist who took the tiniest piece of pottery that was left, and immediately he was like, this is from this period. It was produced outside of Bristol. It came from this thing. It was used for this purpose. And like just being able to recognize like a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of a jug and be able to name where it came from, how old it was, what its use was. It's just astounding.
Yeah, that is one distinct subspecialty. Pottery is really important for archaeologists because it's an everyday item and there tends to be a lot of it. You can construct really detailed chronologies of when it was used and where you can figure out where it was made, what the distribution patterns were. So it gives you dating evidence. Archaeologists love pottery because it can tell you when and where your site dates from. So this kind of brings us around to the question of like, okay, so we've got a site. We figure out where we're going to dig on the site. We open things up. We start to find things. How do we interpret those? There are multiple levels of interpretation happening here. You've got to interpret what it is you're actually seeing in the ground in the first place, because it's not necessarily obvious. And then you've got to figure out how that ties in more broadly with other things, with other sites, with a kind of a broad scale picture of a period or a place. So I'll give you an example of this. Right?
Yeah, let's visit a site.
We're in eastern England.
Are we in a field? Are we in the woods?
Yeah,
Where
we're out in a field. We're out in just some farmer's field. We're probably kind of up on like a slight elevated rise. We've started to dig things up. What we have are a row of dark circular stains in the ground. They're about a foot across. We've got dozens of them.
Is this a physical hole or like
No, we've got is a dark stain in the dirt.
Okay, so we're in a field in England. We've taken off this layer of grass.
Yep.
And we see different dirt-colored patches.
We've got patches of slightly darker dirt in the dirt.
Got it. Okay,
So
I'm in the field.
And they form kind of a rough rectangle. It's maybe 50 feet long, 25 feet across. Nothing impressive here.
I'm
right?
on board.
And then surrounding this kind of rough rectangular shape, we have kind of larger, darker stains.
Got it.
So
okay.
this is how we know we have what is probably a settlement. This rectangle is a hull. It's like a long house built out of timber, and those circular stains are post holes. That's where there was a wooden post in the ground, and it's since rotted away. It leaves a slightly darker stain than the rest of the dirt. We found some pottery. We found some pottery sherds. Those big dark stains around it are what are called sunken floored huts that were probably storage buildings. So what we have here is part of a settlement. We have like a family lived in this thing. Maybe a pretty important figure if you're going to build something this big. The pottery sherds are going to tell us when the site dates to. So you can date these. Saxon period's a little harder because a lot of the pottery is kind of handmade at home. So it's hard to get a precise dating on it, but it's going to tell us, does this date from like 450 to 650 up to the Norman conquest? It's going to give us a date for that when we've got these pottery sherds. So we have to interpret what we see in the ground. What is the building that these relate to? And then we've got to figure out, how does this fit in more broadly? Is it unique for this place and time? Is this the only Anglo-Saxon settlement we found here? Or are there a lot of Anglo-Saxon settlements around here? How does it fit time-wise? How does this fit into roadways and water networks and water transport networks that we can find here? Why is this settlement here in this particular spot? So we've got multiple layers of interpretation that we've got to go with here.
How common is it for different people to build on already established sites?
It's really common. That's one of the things that makes archaeology both interesting and hard. When you have a site, it's really unlikely that people just used it for a few years. You get multiple layers of occupation, multiple layers of building and use at sites. So in Britain, it's not at all uncommon to find Anglo-Saxon settlements or cemeteries built on top of Iron Age or Bronze Age sites. So you might have a Bronze Age burial mound with an Anglo-Saxon cemetery cut into it. So what you find is landscapes get used over and over again. It's one of the things that makes city archaeology hard and confusing is layers of use over time. Like if you have the core of a city, that may stay in use in Europe or the Near East for thousands of years. Just one layer building up right on top of the next. So separating out these different layers can be really hard. It's much easier when a settlement has been entirely abandoned to excavate it. Like, there are villages that are in use now where there have been villages for a couple thousand years. I'll give you another example of this. Like in Italy, one of the things you see kind of as the Roman period turns into the early medieval period is you will get a village built on top of an old villa site, right? So Roman aristocrats loved to live in these big villas. They were often very fancy. It might have had mosaic floors and bathhouses built in. They were like symbols of power and authority and wealth for the Roman aristocracy. As the Roman aristocracy kind of lost its power and wealth and authority in the early medieval period, the former tenants who had been living on the land of these very powerful aristocrats just built their villages right on top of the old villa or into the old villa. So if you look for some Italian villages, like underneath the current village, underneath is a medieval village, and underneath the medieval village is an early medieval village, and underneath the early medieval village is an old villa, is a villa site.
A question that I have listening to this is, at what point do you go through a site and you decide, this has told me all it's going to today, or I've gotten all I've needed? Because with all these layers, it's similar with like geology. in the sense that it's infinite.
It's mostly time, the time you have available to you, and funding.
Okay.
Is usually what answers that question for you. How long can we afford to be out here doing this? How long does our grant run? Or if you're doing commercial archaeology, like you've got to get things done pretty quickly because you're there on the builder's dollar, and they're trying to get you out so they can go on and build their water main or their sewer or the foundations of the apartment building, what have you.
Sure.
So you're usually trying to work reasonably fast.
That's slightly less romantic than these ideas of like Indiana Jonesy style excavations and multi-year long expeditions across continents to trace down one thing.
Yeah, I mean, you do get multi-year expeditions. There are excavations of places that have been going for decades, where you just have so much to do. And like, you don't always have a lot of labor either. It may just be like a professor and a few grad students out there kind of slowly and methodically working on a site. But yeah, so it can vary. Some sites you get tons of labor and you work through things very quickly. Like that's one of the interesting things about Time Team is they dig all of these sites in 3 days, but that's because they have tons of labor.
Right.
So like normally you're going to have a couple people working in a trench at a time, and it's going to be day after day after day of work to just get down to the bottom of a wall or what have you. It's very time consuming and difficult. That's one of the reasons I really like it is because it's the combination of the practical and the theoretical. Like archaeologists to me are the most fun academics because they are like you have to be kind of theoretically grounded to make sense of all the stuff that you're finding. But it's also an intensely practical thing because you have to be out there like digging in the dirt to try to get this stuff. Like basically every archaeologist is in some way, shape, or form kind of doing practical work. Yeah, so if you happen to find yourself at an academic conference and there are archaeologists around, like that's going to be the most fun group of people. Hands down, guarantee you.
Okay, here's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why do people hate paleontologists?
Do they hate paleontologists?
According to the hit American television show Friends, which ran from 1994 to 2004, they do.
I've only ever seen like 2 episodes of Friends.
Okay, great. Let's move on.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the subspecialties in archaeology. So my personal favorite is bioarchaeology, the study of kind of organic remains from sites. It especially refers to human remains. They can tell you an insane amount about a person's life because bone is plastic. It remolds itself and remodels itself in response to stresses. You can tell if somebody was malnourished. You can tell if they had diseases at some point in their life.
We saw one example of this in a Tides of History episode where we looked at all the longbowmen whose arms were more developed because they had to pull back the weight of that bowstring a bunch.
Yes, bioarchaeology is the discipline that's going to look at that kind of thing. So that is bone remodeling itself in response to stress. If the bones are well preserved enough, you can tell like did somebody spend a lot of time squatting? Did they spend a lot of time lifting and carrying heavy things? Did they spend a lot of time kind of bent over a plow? One of my favorite books on this is called The Body as Material Culture, and its idea is basically that culture expresses itself in the actions that we do habitually, and those actions logically express themselves in kind of patterns of wear and use and stress on bone. So our bodies are cultural artifacts in that sense.
That's fascinating to me.
It's a really interesting book. Archaeology is developing. We have the kind of scientific tools that can tell us a great deal about human life based on the human remains that we find.
I think this subfield of archaeology that's the most interesting to me is this landscape and environmental archaeology.
Yeah.
And because that was something I was not very familiar with. But every time I drive by a hill, I'm like, are you a hill? Or are you a settlement? Or I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and there was this big mound down the street from my house. And I was just like, this is a big weird hill in the middle of nowhere. And it is a Native American preserved mound.
Yeah.
Which is so weird.
It's fascinating, right? Like people have modified their landscape in lots of different ways, in ways that are both kind of like jutting out of the landscape, like those mounds, and in ways that are more subtle too, like networks of ditches. When I was in Ireland doing my master's degree, I did an archaeology course on castles, and we went out and looked at what are called mottes. They're just big mounds that you would then build a timber castle on top of. It doesn't really look like anything. They're all just sitting out in farmers' fields. But it's like, oh, there was at one point a giant timber castle built on top of this really unassuming looking mound that you have here.
Here's a question for you. One of the things that I also noticed during the course of this show so far, I feel like in a lot of ways, science, history, archaeology, anthropology gets kind of a bad rap for being very stiff and very dry when it's really just trying to understand like the whim of human emotion.
Well, human emotion and human need, right? Like
Yeah.
we do these things because we feel like we need to for some reason. So like you make pottery to hold water, or to hold wine, or to use as a cooking pot or what have you. The forms that those take are not necessarily expressions of need. Like they can be aesthetic.
What is the plight of a modern archaeologist? If somebody's looking at Los Angeles, where we do this show right now, like what are they going to find in a city that's built and rebuilt and bulldozed and built on top of like what is that going to look like in 50 years? That also just I don't know. This whole thing blows my mind. I don't know. I don't have a point. I just have a feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it is going to be weird trying to look back at like what we leave behind. Like, how do you interpret those things? And I think most archaeologists are pretty open about the fact that like their interpretations can be wrong and wildly wrong. Like that what you look at 3 stones lined up and you're like, well, 3 stones makes a wall. That is a common saying among archaeologists. What does that wall go to?
Yeah.
Is it a house? Is it a storage building? Is it a barn? Is it actually just a boundary marker between 2 things? This building, how you interpret those things is always going to be fairly open. And good archaeologists are going to be pretty open about the fact that they don't know, or they're going to change their interpretation as new evidence comes out. Like you're working in an interpretive field, and you got to be open about the fact that you could be wrong about that stuff. I think most of them are.
And history is an interpretive field. It's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think historians, especially when you're working with texts, tend to get more locked in. Like, I think historians tend to get more locked into their positions than archaeologists do. Like, because, and this gets to one of the things that I wanted to talk about with archaeology is like you always have new archaeological information coming in. You have new sites being dug. You have new excavations at old sites. You have people who are finding ways to aggregate old data. Like you can come up with new interpretations of vast masses of old evidence. I think that's what's really interesting about archaeology. It's why I like the field quite a bit is like you're not going to get a whole lot of new historical texts at this point for periods before like 1500. For the most part, the written evidence is the written evidence. And what you're trying to do is find new ways to interpret that and new ways to put it together, new questions to ask of that evidence. In archaeology, you're just getting new evidence. Like you're getting new finds, you're getting new kinds of sites. You're getting with a tool like LiDAR. So this was a recent story. Like they found a whole bunch of previously undiscovered Maya ruins in Central America because you can use LiDAR to strip away the jungle canopy, and you're like, oh, holy crap, there was a whole complex here. You can do it with we've talked about DNA on this show too, ancient DNA. Like you can extract DNA from those things. That's a whole new piece of evidence for you to get. So there was a paper came out earlier this year, or maybe late last year, on the Lombards, who were a barbarian group that the historical sources say migrated from kind of Eastern Europe through Hungary and down into Italy. So, like, the reason why there's a region of Lombardy in Italy is because of these invading Lombards. So historians have argued for a very long time about who these Lombards were. How do we understand the social structure here? Were they kind of bound up around a noble family that had some blood relations, or were they all just kind of unrelated? Were they all making their kind of ethnic identity up? Well, so archaeologists have excavated a bunch of Lombard cemeteries. Recently, they went and they tested the skeletons in these cemeteries for DNA, and they found that in these 2 Lombard cemeteries, one in what's now Hungary and one in what's now kind of northern Italy, the central groups were related by blood. There really was kind of a central Lombard group that had a fairly distinctive genetic profile, and they did pick up followers around that who were not necessarily related. So, and you could see this in the cemeteries. You could see this with the finds. Like the finds looked like they were Lombards, and then when you tested the genetics, well, they genetically looked different than the groups that surrounded them. So they had a distinctive ethnic identity expressed through their material culture that was also reflected in their genetics. This is an example of being able to solve a question that historians have argued about for a very long time through the application of new archaeological tools.
Why do you think we're all so obsessed with understanding the world?
Because it's interesting and it keeps you and me in a job.
Okay, Patrick, I've heard a lot about how archaeology is great. There's an entire show called Time Team. dedicated to it. Are there any downsides?
So I think it's easy to end up with a particular kind of site that happens to be really easy to find or that we know how to find can end up defining a whole place or time, right? So I'll give you some examples of this. So in late antique Syria, so kind of the countryside in Syria, we have a whole bunch of villages, like stone-built villages that were abandoned at some point afterwards. You can let these villages stand in for all of late antique Syria. You know what I mean? Because this is the evidence that we have. This becomes our window onto that world.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. The worst case scenario is like this one kind of site stands in for that whole society.
The pyramids in Egypt and sarcophagi. That, in my mind, for a long time was the only picture of Egypt that I had. So it was easy for me to be like, oh, of course I know about Egypt. It's a desert and there's pyramids and, Cleopatra. And that's all you need to know.
Yeah. So if you look at the Valley of the Kings, right, you can look at the tombs, right? You go into the tombs, you got Tutankhamun's tomb, you got all these crazy things in there, all these crazy decorations. You could also excavate the village that the workers who built the Valley of the Kings lived in. They've actually done that. There's a village very close to the Valley of the Kings where all the workers lived. Both of those things are telling you something about the society that produced them, right? Like you're getting different kinds of evidence to tell you about that. The problem is like, what if you don't know how to find the villages that people lived in, or it doesn't survive for whatever reason? We talked about this a little while ago with like the stains in the ground. Like that's what an Anglo-Saxon settlement looks like when you dig it. They didn't build in stone, right? So these things are ephemeral. They're very hard to find. What if you have a society that either doesn't use much pottery or doesn't use pottery at all? Like in a lot of post-Roman Britain, there's no pottery to find. Like what they made was all handmade and local. The sherds that you find of it can almost be indistinguishable from little pebbles and rocks. So how are you going to find a settlement?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's easy for us to be overly optimistic about what archaeology can tell us if the sites don't exist in the first place. We don't know how to find them. They don't preserve. One of the weaknesses for us talking about the Roman economy, we know a lot about how the Roman economy worked. One of the ways we know a lot about how the Roman economy worked is because liquid products like wine and olive oil were carried in amphorae, which were ceramic containers, which you find all over the place. So you can reconstruct really detailed trade networks for the Roman Empire based on the distribution of these amphorae or based on the distribution of ceramic goods. That tells us a lot about the economy of the Roman Empire. What it doesn't tell us about is things that were goods that were moved in containers that were not ceramic, right? So it doesn't tell us about grain, which was not carried in ceramic containers.
Wool trading. Exactly.
It doesn't tell us about cloth. It doesn't tell us about the papyrus trade, which doesn't survive outside of Egypt. It doesn't tell us about the slave trade, when and where a slave trade existed, because that's not something that's going to show up archaeologically in that sense. It doesn't tell us about a whole lot of things. So we can kind of talk ourselves into thinking that we know more about this than we do in some cases.
Cool.
Yeah. So that would be one of the downsides is if you think that this can tell you more than it actually can, when really like let's say you've got a village site in medieval England and you're wondering, what do these people do with their time? Well, it's entirely possible that what they did with their time does not show up in any archaeologically identifiable way. But that's also what I like about archaeology as opposed to history is I love knowing what people did with their time, and archaeology gets us way closer to answering that question than history often does.
Right.
Because what we have is material culture. What we have are the objects that people interacted with on a daily basis. We can look at the landscapes that they interacted with, the landscapes that they lived in and walked in and worked in. That's why I love archaeology, is because it gets us way closer to the actual lived experience of people often than history is able to do.
Okay, so what is the hottest take in the field of archaeology today? What's going on? What are the newest developments? Because we can pick up pottery sherds and look at them. We've been doing that for a while.
Hottest take in archaeology.
Yeah. You've mentioned LiDAR, which is like radar with lasers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think DNA testing is a big one.
Yeah.
Right now, we're in the midst of a revolution in ancient DNA where it has become much more efficient, much cheaper, and much easier to fully sequence samples of ancient DNA that's recovered from archaeological sites. I think that is the big and sexy thing that's happening right now. They've more or less solved some really big questions that archaeologists have been asking for a very long time. So like, who were the speakers of Indo-European, the language that evolved into German and Italian and English, Spanish, all of these, basically every language spoken in Western Europe, with the exception of Basque, is an Indo-European one. So where did this come from? Who were the initial Indo-European speakers? DNA has more or less answered that question. They came from the Eurasian steppe in the Bronze Age. The question of who were the first farmers.
I remember it also causing some controversy. Mary Beard, I think last year, didn't she write that article about Africans in Britain?
Africans in Roman Britain. Yeah. It was a whole
that was a
whole
mess.
series of controversies. And because that shows the downside to it is that genetics isn't going to answer all of your questions, and the samples that you have access to are not going to give you necessarily a fully representative answer either. And people who don't actually know that much about the genetics of this period, or about the broader place into which those genetics fit, can draw some conclusions that are not especially helpful or useful, and can be actively misleading. So I think the genetics is the current big and sexy thing that's happening. But honestly, my guess is that the bigger development that you're going to be able to draw moving on has to do with aggregating large amounts of data, especially with pottery. I think that you're going to be able to do things like draw much, much, much more fine-grained and detailed pictures of trade networks at various periods throughout history on the basis of pottery finds, because that's the kind of thing that like modern tools in terms of like mapping, like GIS and just kind of being able to deal with huge chunks of information. That's the kind of thing that modern methods were made for. It's not as headline grabbing as LiDAR or DNA is, but I think it's going to tell us a lot more about how people actually did and kind of long-term changes in the economy and society.
That makes a ton of sense. Computers are rad.
Computers are rad.
Okay, Patrick, we've spent a ton of time talking about archaeology. Why is it important for historians to understand archaeology?
It allows you to ask and answer different sets of questions. And sometimes those questions overlap with what we can ask from textual sources. So how did the economy of the early Middle Ages work? To answer that question, you're going to need to look at textual sources. You're also going to need to look at material culture, at material remains. And those two different bodies of evidence are not necessarily going to give you the same answer. If you ask, what happened as the Roman Empire fell apart? That's a really big question, right? It's one that I've spent a fair bit of time trying to answer over the years. Textual sources are going to provide one set of answers to that question. Material remains are going to provide another set of answers to that question. Those answers can look very, very different. So I think that's part of the reason why it's important. Sometimes your different bodies of evidence confirm each other. Sometimes they tell you way, way, way different things. Figuring out how those bodies of information speak to each other tells you a lot more about how the past actually was. That to me is the biggest attraction of archaeology, that if you want to be able to answer questions, then you need to have this tool in your toolbox. Also, I just think it's rad to dig stuff up, man. It's really cool. It's really cool to be able to dig down and be able to see like this was a wall that people sat against, or this held up a house that people lived in. This was a piece of pottery that somebody drank beer out of. That's pretty dang cool. I like that a lot.
I like it too.
Thanks so much for joining us here today. Be sure and drop me a line if you'd like to chat about archaeology, about the fall of the Roman Empire, about the rise of the modern world, any of that stuff. You can find me on Twitter at Patrick_Wyman or on Facebook at Patrick Wyman MMA. You can find Leah at Leah Goes Where. You can find the show at Tides History. Tides of History is written and narrated by me, Patrick Wyman. Sound engineering and sound designing is by Sergio Enriquez. From Wondery, the executive producer is Hernan Lopez, and the producer is Leah Sutherland. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, from Wondery, this has been Tides of History.
Beautiful.